Picture this: a kingdom on the brink, its borders shrinking under the weight of invaders, its people whispering of doom. The treasury is nearly empty, the fields are bare, and the only thing more scarce than food is hope. Yet somewhere in a dimly lit hall, a ruler stares at a map, knowing that survival hinges on one impossible task: building an army from nothing. No seasoned knights, no stockpiled weapons, just a handful of loyal followers and the desperate will to fight back. This wasn't some rare nightmare, it was the reality for countless medieval leaders, and the choices they made in those moments decided the fate of entire nations. What does it take to forge an army out of thin air? How do you turn farmers into fighters, or cobble together a force capable of standing against hardened warriors when every day brings the enemy closer? The answer is a tapestry of grit, cunning, and sheer improvisation. Medieval rulers didn't have the luxury of time or endless resources. They had to work with what they had, leveraging feudal bonds, calling in favors, even bending age-old traditions to rally anyone who could hold a spear. But here's the thing: the armies they built didn't just defend lands, they reshaped history. From the muddy training grounds to the chaos of the battlefield, every decision was a gamble with lives hanging in the balance. This is the story of how kingdoms on the edge defied the odds. We're not just talking about battles or glory, we're diving into the raw, unglamorous work of recruitment, the frantic scramble for supplies, and the unbreakable spirit of those who refused to surrender. You'll see how desperation bred innovation, how ordinary people became the backbone of armies, and how the shadow of defeat forced leaders to think in ways no one had before. By the end, you won't just understand how it was done, you'll feel the weight of every choice, the tension of every moment, and the triumph of those who pulled off the impossible. So let's step into their world, where every decision could mean salvation or ruin, and discover what it truly took to build an army from scratch. The feudal system wasn't just a hierarchy, it was a living, breathing military machine. At its core, it ran on a simple exchange: land for loyalty. A lord would grant parcels of territory to his vassals, and in return, those vassals owed him a set number of armed fighters for a fixed period each year. Knights clad in chainmail, squires trained in combat, and men-at-arms with years of experience, these were the professional soldiers of their day, the backbone of any medieval force. But here's the catch: feudal obligations had limits. A vassal might only be required to serve 40 days annually, and if the fighting dragged on longer, the ruler had a problem. When kingdoms faced true desperation, invaders at the gates, harvests burning, cities under siege, those tidy feudal contracts suddenly seemed inadequate. This is where innovation kicked in. Kings and lords began stretching the rules, calling up not just their direct vassals but demanding service from lesser nobles who normally wouldn't be obligated. They leaned on towns and cities, trading tax exemptions or political favors for militia troops. Even free peasants, who typically spent their lives behind plows, found themselves handed spears and shields in exchange for promises of protection or freedom from serfdom. Take England during the 100 Years' War as an example. Facing constant French invasions, English kings issued commissions of array documents authorizing local officials to conscript every able-bodied man in their region. Suddenly, blacksmiths, fishermen, and even clerks were drilling with pikes in village squares. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. The feudal system didn't collapse under this pressure, it evolved. Lords who once relied solely on aristocratic warriors now found themselves commanding mixed forces of knights, town militias, and raw recruits. The lesson was clear: When survival was on the line, tradition took a backseat to necessity. Yet this patchwork recruitment came with risks. A force stitched together from feudal levies, urban volunteers, and hastily trained peasants lacked the cohesion of a professional army. Discipline could crumble under pressure, and rivalries between nobles sometimes flared mid-campaign. But in those dire moments when kingdoms teetered on collapse, flexibility mattered more than perfection. The real genius of medieval rulers wasn't just in summoning troops, it was in binding these disparate groups into something resembling unity, convincing them that their fates were intertwined. Whether through oaths, bribes, or sheer charisma, they turned obligation into something deeper, a shared will to fight. Cities weren't just centers of trade, they were sleeping giants of military power. As medieval towns grew richer, their walls didn't just protect merchants and craftsmen. They housed a new kind of warrior. Urban militias, mustered from guilds and neighborhoods, became the secret weapon of kings who couldn't afford to rely solely on feudal levies. These weren't peasants dragged reluctantly into service, but proud citizens defending homes they'd built with their own hands. And here's what made them dangerous. They fought not out of obligation, but because their survival was tied to their city's fate. The deals struck between rulers and towns tell the real story. In exchange for taxes or political freedoms, cities like Florence or Ghent won the right to raise and command their own troops. A weaver might spend his days at the loom, but when the alarm bells rang, he'd grab his halberd and fall into formation alongside his neighbors. These militias drilled regularly, often funded by guild treasuries, turning market squares into training grounds. They lacked the polish of knights, but they made up for it in numbers, cohesion, and something professionals often underestimated: local knowledge. A militia defending its own streets could turn narrow alleys into death traps for invading armies. The Battle of Golden Spurs in 1302 showed just how potent citizen soldiers could be. Flemish townsmen, mostly cloth workers and tradesmen, faced down the flower of French chivalry. The knights expected an easy victory against what they saw as a rabble, but the Flemish militia used their pikes to create an impenetrable wall, exploiting muddy terrain that left the heavily armored French knights floundering. By day's end, the golden spurs of fallen knights littered the field, giving the battle its name. It was a wake-up call for medieval Europe. Commoners could not only fight, they could win. This shift reshaped power dynamics across the continent. Kings who once dismissed towns as mere moneymakers began courting them as military partners. Urban militias became bargaining chips in political games. Their loyalty could tip the balance in civil wars or rebellions, and for the citizens themselves. Bearing arms wasn't just duty, it was a path to respect. In an age where status usually came from birth, the battlefield became one place where a skilled militiaman could earn recognition beyond his station. The Age of Knights still had centuries left, but the writing was on the wall. Warfare would never again be the exclusive domain of the nobility. Gold, not glory, became the lifeblood of medieval wars when kingdoms faced annihilation. When feudal levies and town militias weren't enough, rulers turned to mercenaries, seasoned killers who fought not for crowns or causes, but for coin. These weren't amateur conscripts, they were professionals, often veterans of a dozen campaigns, armed with the latest weapons and tactics. A prince could raise 1,000 such men in weeks, provided his purse was deep enough. But this convenience came at a cost far beyond gold. The rise of mercenaries transformed medieval power structures. Wealthy merchants and bankers, particularly in Italian city-states like Florence and Venice, realized they could fund entire armies in exchange for trading rights, tax breaks, or even noble titles. The Medici family didn't just sell silk and spices, they became kingmakers. bankrolling mercenary companies that could make or break dynasties. This created a dangerous precedent. Military power now flowed through counting houses as much as castles. Yet mercenaries were a double-edged sword. Take the infamous White Company, a band of English and German soldiers for hire who ravaged Italy in the 14th century. They switched sides mid-battle if the enemy offered higher pay, leaving former employers stranded. Their leader, Sir John Hawkwood, became both legend and cautionary tale, a man who carved his coat of arms into history not through loyalty, but by auctioning his sword to the highest bidder. Stories like these gave mercenaries a notorious reputation, but desperate rulers had little choice. When survival hung in the balance, even unreliable blades were better than none. The financial strain could cripple kingdoms. England's Henry II nearly bankrupted his treasury paying Flemish mercenaries during his wars in France. Some rulers resorted to melting down church silver or borrowing from Jewish moneylenders at staggering interest rates. And when the money ran out, mercenaries didn't politely disband, they often turned on their employers, looting the very lands they'd been hired to protect. This era proved one brutal truth: warfare was no longer just about courage or strategy. It was a numbers game played with ledgers where the richest throne, not necessarily the strongest army, often survived. The age of chivalry still sang of noble knights, but the future belonged to those who understood that in war, gold was the deadliest weapon of all. Faith didn't just shape medieval lives, it forged armies. When kings ran short of knights and mercenaries grew too expensive, they turned to a force more powerful than steel: belief. The church didn't just bless wars, it weaponized devotion, transforming peasants into crusaders and local skirmishes into holy missions. This wasn't mere recruitment, it was alchemy, turning fear of damnation into unshakable courage on the battlefield. The Crusades showed this power in its purest form. When Pope Urban II stood in a field at Clermont in 1095, his words didn't just promise victory, they offered salvation. God wills it. Became the rallying cry for tens of thousands who abandoned plows and workshops to march across continents. These weren't professional soldiers, but cobblers, farmers, even children, convinced their sacrifice would erase lifetimes of sin. The church stoked this fervor with relics, pilgrimages, and the ultimate prize, a direct ticket to heaven for those who fell in battle. But holy warriors weren't limited to distant Jerusalem. In Spain, the centuries-long Reconquista against Muslim rule saw knights and commoners alike fighting under banners of saints, their swords blessed by bishops. In Eastern Europe, Teutonic knights carved out a crusader state in Prussia, blending monastic discipline with military might. Even ordinary wars gained religious weight. English longbowmen at Agincourt prayed to St. George before volleys that would decide kingdoms. What made faith such an effective recruiting tool? It erased the line between soldier and martyr. A man who might hesitate to die for a lord's ambition would gladly bleed for God's approval. Clergy stoked this mindset, framing enemies not just as political threats, but as existential dangers to Christendom itself. Fear of divine punishment proved stronger than feudal oaths when a priest declared resistance a sacred duty. Even the poorest peasant felt called to fight. Yet this spiritual conscription had dark consequences. The same fervor that inspired heroism also justified atrocities. Crusaders slaughtered Jewish communities on their way to Jerusalem, convinced purging infidels at home pleased God as much as fighting abroad. In France, the Albigensian Crusade turned neighbor against neighbor, with entire towns massacred over doctrinal differences. Faith could unite, but it could also divide with terrifying efficiency. By the late Middle Ages, the Church's grip on warfare began to loosen. Mercenaries cared more for pay than prayers, and rulers grew wary of popes using holy wars for political ends. But the legacy endured the idea that a cause could be sacred, that dying in battle might mean more than just another corpse in the mud. Long after the last Crusader knight faded from memory, that spark of divine purpose would ignite armies for centuries to come. Imagine a field of farmers, their hands calloused from plows, not swords, standing frozen as a veteran knight barks commands. These men knew how to harvest wheat, not wield weapons. Yet within weeks, they'd be expected to hold a line against charging knights or volleys of arrows. This wasn't just training, it was a desperate race against time, where the difference between order and chaos came down to how quickly muscle memory could replace instinct. The first lesson was always the simplest: fear the weapon less than the man beside you. Peasants handed spears would instinctively flinch or drop them until instructors drilled into them that a dropped spear meant a broken line, and a broken line meant death. Veterans used brutal simplicity. Wooden stakes planted in the ground taught recruits to stand firm, while constant repetition turned clumsy thrusts into reflexive motions. Archers faced even steeper odds. A longbow required years to master, but in crises, boys as young as 12 were handed bows and told to loose arrows en masse, accuracy sacrificed for sheer volume. Discipline was the invisible weapon. Knights and sergeants at arms, seasoned fighters who'd survived multiple campaigns, knew an undisciplined mob would shatter at the first clash. So they imposed order through relentless drills. Formations like the Schiltron, where spearmen stood shoulder to shoulder in a defensive ring, turned individuals into a single entity. The goal wasn't elegance, it was survival. A recruit who could hold his position under the deafening roar of an approaching cavalry charge was worth 10 who fought bravely but alone. Time was the enemy. With invaders burning villages, training couldn't wait for perfection. Some lords resorted to psychological tricks, staging mock battles with blunted weapons to simulate chaos, or having veterans recount graphic tales of what happened to armies that broke formation. The message was clear: stick together or die separately. Even superstition played a role. Priests blessed banners and weapons, convincing recruits divine favor would protect those who stood their ground. The results were often shockingly effective. At the Battle of Crécy in 1346, English longbowmen, many fresh from farms, decimated French knights through disciplined volleys. Their secret: months of enforced practice, turning terror into routine. But the margin between success and massacre was razor thin. A single lapse in training, a line that wavered, archers who panicked could doom thousands. That pressure forged an unspoken truth of medieval warfare. The real battle wasn't just fought on fields, but in those frantic weeks when ordinary men learned to become something more. A castle's armory wasn't built in a day, but when war came knocking, kingdoms had to outfit armies in weeks. Forget gleaming rows of identical weapons. Medieval armories were patchwork collections, where a lord's engraved sword might hang beside a farmer's repurposed scythe. The scramble for equipment revealed a brutal truth. In war, necessity trumped quality every time. Confiscation became the quickest solution. Kings issued right of prize decrees, legally commandeering weapons from nobles, towns, even churches. In 1294, when England's Edward I faced rebellion in Wales, he stripped armor from London's guild halls and melted down church bells for arrowheads. Townsfolk who'd kept family swords as heirlooms suddenly found royal officials at their doors. But even these desperate measures barely covered the basics. For every knight fitted with polished plate armor, a dozen levies marched with little more than leather jerkins and sharpened stakes. Blacksmiths became the unsung heroes of wartime production. Village forges that normally shod horses or repaired plows now operated day and night, turning out spearheads by the hundreds. The work was crude but effective. A spear required just 3 pounds of iron compared to a sword's 5, and could be made in a fraction of the time. Armor presented greater challenges. Chainmail took months to weave, so smiths improvised with jackets of plates, stitching small metal squares between layers of cloth. These wouldn't stop a lance, but they could turn aside glancing blows enough to keep a man fighting another day. Battlefields doubled as armories. After victories like Agincourt, English archers swarmed over fallen French knights, prying off gauntlets, helmets, even the rings from fingers. This grim harvest wasn't just looting, it was survival. A single captured suit of plate armor could equip an entire squad of men-at-arms. The Welsh became particularly notorious for stripping corpses bare, earning both fear and grudging respect. "They fight like devils," one chronicler wrote, "and dress like the men they've killed." The gap between noble and commoner gear told its own story. While knights rode into battle covered head to toe in steel worth a fortune, their foot soldiers often wore nothing more than quilted gambesons, thick padded jackets that offered scant protection. Archers frequently went without helmets to improve visibility, trusting speed over armor. This disparity wasn't just about wealth, it reflected medieval warfare's brutal calculus. Knights were investments, years of training encased in expensive metal. Peasant levies were tragically more replaceable, yet necessity bred strange innovations. When the Swiss Confederacy revolted against Habsburg rule in the 14th century, their peasant armies turned alpine tools into weapons. Halberds, essentially axe heads mounted on long poles, could hook knights from saddles or smash through armor. Even simple quarterstaffs, when wielded by men who'd used them daily as shepherds, became deadly in formation. The lesson was clear: when resources ran thin, ingenuity mattered as much as steel. By war's end, the battle for equipment left lasting marks. Towns demanded their confiscated weapons back, often finding them broken or lost. Blacksmiths shifted from war production to rebuilding farm tools, their forges quieter but their skills sharper. And somewhere in a noble's treasury, a dented helmet taken from a fallen enemy would gather dust, a silent testament to the desperate scramble that turned peasants into soldiers and tools into weapons. 1,000 armored men could conquer a kingdom, but only if they didn't starve first. Feeding a medieval army wasn't just about filling bellies. It was a logistical nightmare that made or broke campaigns. Picture this: a column of soldiers stretching for miles, each man needing at least 3 pounds of bread and 2 quarts of ale daily just to function. Now multiply that by 10,000, and you'll understand why the smartest generals spent more time worrying about grain carts than battle tactics. Foraging was the quickest solution, but also the riskiest. In friendly lands, armies relied on purveyance, a polite term for forced purchases at fixed prices. Villagers watched helplessly as officials marked their livestock and grain stores with royal seals, promising payment that often never came. When supplies ran low, soldiers turned to living off the land, stripping orchards bare and slaughtering livestock. Chroniclers tell of regions left so barren after an army's passage that survivors resorted to eating bark. But in enemy territory, foraging became deadly. Scouts might return empty-handed or not at all, ambushed by locals defending their last sacks of flour. This desperation birthed one of warfare's oldest tricks, the scorched earth. During his retreat from Moscow in 1812, Napoleon found this lesson written in ashes, but medieval commanders knew it centuries earlier. Welsh rebels burned their own crops rather than feed English invaders, while French peasants during the 100 Years' War hid grain in caves. An army without forage withered like a plant without roots, its strength ebbing away with each hungry mile. The solution: supply trains that became mobile cities. The Crusader army at Antioch in 1097 dragged along hundreds of ox carts carrying wheat, cheese, and smoked fish. But these caravans were vulnerable at Dorylaeum. Turkish horsemen annihilated a Crusader supply column, leaving the main force stranded. Smart commanders diversified. Henry V of England shipped biscuit from London to Normandy, while Frederick Barbarossa's German crusaders barged supplies down rivers. Yet even the best plans faltered. Weather ruined food, rats infested grain sacks, and corrupt officials skimmed from the top. Starvation reshaped battles more decisively than any sword. At the Siege of Acre in 1191, Crusaders and Saracens alike resorted to eating their horses, then dogs, then reportedly even human flesh. Dysentery from spoiled food killed more soldiers than arrows, turning camps into reeking death traps. The real measure of a general wasn't just his courage in battle, it was whether he could keep his men fed long enough to reach the fight. The legacy of these struggles echoes in modern military science. Napoleon's maxim about armies marching on their stomachs was born from medieval suffering. Today's MREs trace their lineage to those desperate days when a kingdom's fate hung not on valor, but on whether a wagon load of grain arrived before the mutinies began. A ragged army of farmers and townsfolk might have spears, but without a leader they were just a mob waiting to scatter. The real alchemy of medieval warfare wasn't just in raising troops, it was in binding them together under commanders who could turn fear into resolve. These weren't always the polished aristocrats from tapestries. Sometimes the most effective leaders emerged from the chaos itself, battle-hardened knights who'd survived a dozen campaigns, priests who wielded scripture like a weapon, or minor nobles whose charisma outshone their titles. Take Bertrand du Guesclin, the scarred Breton knight who became France's savior during the 100 Years' War. Born too ugly for courtly life, chroniclers called him built like a barrel with a face to match. He earned loyalty through sheer competence. While other nobles chased glory in reckless charges, du Guesclin mastered the art of retreat, preserving his outnumbered forces to fight another day. His secret: he ate the same rotten rations as his men, slept in the same muddy fields, and always positioned himself at the rear during retreats, the most dangerous post where deserters were likeliest to bolt. Soldiers followed him not because they had to, but because they believed he'd keep them alive. But charisma alone couldn't hold an army together. Discipline required a delicate balance of carrot and stick. The Black Prince, Edward of Woodstock, famously executed looters during his chevauchées across France, yet he also rewarded valor with shares of plunder and public praise. His troops knew the rules: cross the line and you'd hang, prove your worth and you'd rise. This fairness bred a fierce loyalty. Even after the prince's death, veterans of his campaigns told stories of how he'd kneel to bandage a common archer's wounds, or split his last flask of wine among the wounded. Religious leaders played their part too. Bishop Adhemar of Lepi didn't just bless the First Crusade, he marched with it, mediating between quarreling nobles and reminding knights that their violence served divine justice. When supplies ran low, he organized foraging parties with monastic precision. And when morale crumbled during the brutal siege of Antioch, it was Adhemar who staged a procession with the Holy Lance, convincing starving men they fought under God's direct favor. Faith in his hands became logistics. The worst leaders learned harsh lessons. At Nicopolis in 1396, French knights dismissed their Hungarian allies as cowards, then charged headlong into Ottoman traps without scouts or strategy. The result, a slaughter so complete it took decades for Burgundy to recover its fighting men. Arrogance, it turned out, was deadlier than any arrow. Great commanders understood something deeper. An army's strength lay in its sense of shared fate. The Welsh rebel Owain Glyndwr didn't just rally his people against English rule, he revived ancient prophecies, staged crowned bardic ceremonies, and even promised a Welsh university. His guerrilla war lasted 15 years not because he had more resources, but because he made every fighter feel part of a story larger than themselves. That was the true test of leadership, convincing a shoemaker with a pike that his stand on a muddy hill mattered to history. And when it worked, it turned desperation into something unbreakable. Siege warfare didn't just test an army's strength, it exposed its soul. Picture a freshly mustered force, still smelling of hearth smoke and sweat, staring up at castle walls that might as well have been mountains. These weren't the quick skirmishes of open battle where courage could carry the day. Sieges were grueling marathons of mud, blood, and boredom, where the real enemy was often time itself. For a new army, the first siege was a reckoning. Would they crumble under the weight of dysentery and desertion, or forge themselves into something unbreakable? Defenders had the advantage of stone, but attackers held the power of ingenuity. Without seasoned engineers, a hastily assembled force might waste weeks building ladders too short or siege towers that collapsed under their own weight. Yet some commanders turned desperation into brilliance. During the Siege of Orleans in 1429, the French, outnumbered and demoralized, used makeshift barges to slip supplies past English blockades, proving that even raw troops could outthink their foes. Meanwhile, defenders relied on psychological warfare, dropping rotting carcasses over walls to spread disease or taunting attackers with feasts held just out of arrow range. Every day the siege dragged on, the more it became a battle of wills. Morale was the fragile thread holding armies together. In the trenches, hunger gnawed at discipline faster than any enemy. Chroniclers tell of soldiers boiling leather straps for broth or bribing sentries to look the other way as they slipped into the night. But the armies that endured often shared one trait: a leader who understood that hope was as vital as rations. At the Siege of Malta in 1565, the Knights Hospitaller kept their outgunned defenders fighting by circulating rumors of approaching relief fleets, even when none existed. The lie bought them just enough resolve to hold until real reinforcements arrived. Weather could be deadlier than arrows. Autumn rains turned camps into quagmires, rusting armor and rotting bowstrings. Winter freezes left men huddled around sputtering fires, their breath fogging the air as they watched the castle's smoke rise, warm and mocking. Some sieges collapsed not from assault, but from the slow, grinding erosion of spirit. The English at Berwick in 1318 abandoned their positions after months of futility, their ranks thinned not by Scottish blades, but by frostbite and despair. Yet when a new army triumphed, the victory resonated for generations. The Swiss at Merton in 1476, mostly farmers and tradesmen, shattered Burgundy's professional forces by maintaining discipline through weeks of tension before launching a perfectly timed assault. Their success wasn't just tactical, it proved that unity and grit could outweigh experience. Every groan of a trebuchet, every night spent shivering under the stars, was a lesson. Sieges didn't just break walls. They revealed what an army was truly made of. While castles and knights dominate medieval lore, the fate of kingdoms often hinged on something far less glamorous: wooden hulls slicing through choppy waters. Coastal rulers faced a cruel paradox. Though surrounded by water, building a navy from scratch made assembling an army look simple. Ships required specialized timber that took decades to grow, rope makers who knew their craft, and sailors who could read the wind rather than just hold a spear. Yet when invaders came by sea, these floating fortresses became the difference between survival and slaughter. Merchant vessels became accidental warships in times of crisis. Kings issued arrest warrants for civilian ships, commandeering them for naval service. A cog that normally hauled wool from England to Flanders might find itself retrofitted with wooden castles fore and aft, its crew handed crossbows instead of cargo manifests. The Hanseatic League, Europe's powerhouse trading network, constantly battled monarchs trying to press their sleek cogs into battle. But these conversions were stopgaps. Merchant ships sat too low in the water for proper combat, their crews unused to the coordinated chaos of naval warfare. Coastal communities became unsung naval recruiting grounds. Fishing villages from Brittany to Norway were essentially maritime boot camps, where boys learned to handle boats before they could ride horses. When war came, kings drafted these fishermen en masse, offering extra rations of salt fish or exemptions from land taxes. The English sink ports owed their privileges to this exact bargain, in exchange for providing 57 ships and crew for 15 days annually. They kept their autonomy. But these sailors weren't professional fighters. A man who could haul nets in a storm might freeze when facing a volley of arrows, and coastal militias often melted away when their homes were no longer directly threatened. The real challenge lay in naval logistics. Unlike armies that could forage, ships needed everything brought aboard. Fresh water spoiled within weeks, and weevils infested biscuit supplies within days. The Venetian arsenal's legendary efficiency, where a galley could be built, armed, and launched in a single day, was the exception, not the rule. Most medieval navies limped along with rotting hulls and patched sails. At Sluys in 1340, the French Navy's disorganization was so catastrophic that English archers picked off defenders like ducks in a pond, their ships hopelessly tangled together. Yet when naval power worked, it reshaped history. Byzantine fire ships saved Constantinople from Arab sieges by turning the sea itself into a weapon. The Norse longboats that terrorized Europe for centuries proved speed and maneuverability could outmatch brute strength. And in the Mediterranean, the rise of gunpowder-armed galleys marked the beginning of the end for floating castles. The lesson was clear. Kingdoms that forgot their fleets did so at their peril, because the sea, unlike a border fort, could bring the enemy to your doorstep overnight. The battlefield wasn't the only place wars were fought. Some of the most decisive blows came from shadows and whispers. While knights polished their armor, a different kind of warrior moved silently through enemy camps and taverns, trading in secrets rather than steel. Medieval commanders knew victory often hinged on knowing where the enemy would march before they did, or convincing them to stand where arrows would fall thickest. This was the art of war unseen, a dance of deception where a single well-placed lie could topple kingdoms. Scouts were the eyes of any army, but their work went far beyond counting enemy tents. Skilled trackers could read a landscape like a manuscript. Broken twigs revealed marching routes, dung heaps indicated troop numbers, and the absence of birds might signal an ambush ahead. The Mongols elevated this to a science, their light cavalry scouts covering 60 miles a day to relay messages through smoke signals and arrow scrolls. Meanwhile, European armies employed local woodsmen who knew every deer path, turning geography into a weapon. A commander ignorant of the terrain might march his forces into a swamp or a box canyon, where nature would do the killing for him. But information wasn't just gathered, it was manufactured. Spies disguised as merchants or pilgrims infiltrated enemy courts, their ears tuned to drunken boasts or muttered grievances. The Byzantines maintained an entire bureau of deception, forging letters to spark rebellions or bribing translators to subtly alter diplomatic messages. During the 100 Years' War, English agents spread rumors that the French king planned to abandon his allies, causing entire towns to surrender without a fight. The most effective lies contained kernels of truth. A fabricated story about contaminated wells gained traction faster if the enemy was already rationing water. Sabotage turned everyday objects into traps. Blacksmiths hired by both sides might deliberately weaken armor straps, while bakers could lace bread with laxatives before a critical battle. The Welsh were notorious for poisoning streams with animal carcasses, forcing invading armies to carry water supplies over treacherous terrain. Even weather could be weaponized. During the siege of Château-Gaillard in 1204. French soldiers waited for winter freeze to scale the castle's latrine chute, knowing its defenses would be thinnest where the icy wind blew hardest. Perhaps the most devastating weapon was psychological warfare. Before the Battle of Agincourt, English archers planted stakes in the ground to break cavalry charges, but they also sharpened them in full view of the French knights, letting dread do half the work. The Ottomans perfected terror tactics, parading captured enemies outside besieged cities to erode morale. And when the Swiss Confederacy rebelled, their leaders spread prophecies of an avenging bear that would maul their Habsburg oppressors, a myth so potent it became self-fulfilling. These shadow games carried immense risk. Captured spies faced gruesome executions, often tortured first to reveal their networks. Yet the rewards outweighed the dangers. A single turncoat gatekeeper could surrender a castle untouched, saving months of siege. A forged letter might dissolve an alliance, leaving an enemy isolated. While chroniclers glorified heroic charges, the shrewdest commanders understood wars weren't just won by the strongest arm, but by the keenest mind and the best-kept secrets. A wedding ring could be deadlier than a sword in medieval politics. When kingdoms teetered on collapse, rulers didn't just reach for their swords. They reached for marriage contracts and parchment treaties, knowing that the right alliance might buy them the breathing room to rebuild their armies. The daughter of a desperate king became a bargaining chip, her dowry not just gold and land, but the promise of fresh troops at a critical hour. Yet these deals were written on shifting sand. Today's brother-in-arms could be tomorrow's invader, and the art of survival often meant knowing when to embrace an ally and when to stab them in the back. Take the tangled web of the 100 Years' War. English kings claimed the French throne through marriage ties, but their French cousins saw those same bloodlines as grounds for war. Alliances flipped with the seasons. Burgundy sided with England against France, only to switch sides when the political winds changed. The Duchy of Brittany played both sides so deftly that its knights sometimes found themselves facing each other on the battlefield, their loyalties divided between fealty and family. These weren't just political maneuvers, they were lifelines. A small state like Navarre survived by renting its armies to the highest bidder, its kings mastering the delicate dance of appearing indispensable to both sides. Yet betrayal lurked behind every handshake. In 1476, Charles the Bold of Burgundy learned this the hard way. After years of trusting Swiss mercenaries, he marched into battle at Nancy expecting their support, only to find they'd secretly renewed contracts with his enemies. His frozen corpse was discovered days later, stripped bare by looters. The lesson echoed across Europe. Trust was a currency that devalued quickly in war. Even the church, which brokered truces in God's name, couldn't prevent rulers from breaking oaths when survival was at stake. The most successful leaders treated alliances like seasonal crops, planted carefully, harvested ruthlessly. Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain united feuding kingdoms through marriage, then leveraged that unity to crush Granada. But their genius lay in timing. They knew when to nurture alliances and when to discard them. When the French threatened Naples, they first partnered with Aragon to resist, then abandoned their allies the moment Spanish interests were secure, cold-blooded. Perhaps effective, undeniably, this high-stakes poker game extended beyond nobility. towns and guilds forged pacts with rulers in exchange for protection, only to discover too late that their guarantees were written in disappearing ink. The Flemish cities learned this when their French allies stood by during English reprisals, leaving them to burn. Even peasants understood the fragile nature of loyalty. During the Great Peasant Revolt of 1381, villages that had sworn oaths to rebel leaders were quick to denounce them when royal armies approached. The true masters of this game weren't the conquerors, but the survivors. Tiny Portugal outlasted its larger neighbors by playing Castile against Aragon, then pivoting to maritime expansion when land routes became too dangerous. Hungary's Matthias Corvinus kept both the Ottomans and Holy Roman Empire at bay through a dizzying series of feints and fake truces, buying decades of peace. Their strategies shared one thread: alliances were tools, not bonds. In a world where today's friend might be tomorrow's executioner, the wisest rulers kept their daggers and their options close. War wasn't just fought with swords and spears. It was waged with ledgers and coin purses. The moment a ruler decided to raise an army, the real battle began in vaults and market squares where gold flowed faster than blood. A single knight's armor cost as much as a farmer's yearly harvest, and feeding 10,000 men for a month could bankrupt a small duchy. Survival demanded more than bravery. It required a ruthless grasp of economics, where every decision carried the weight of ruin. Taxes became the first weapon of choice, but they were a double-edged sword. Kings imposed scutage, payments in lieu of military service, forcing nobles to buy their way out of war. Peasants faced tallages, arbitrary demands that could strip a village of its last bushel of grain. In England, the Domesday Book wasn't just a census, it was a cheat sheet for squeezing every possible penny from the land. Yet push too hard, and the very people who funded your army might revolt. The Jacquerie uprising in France began when starving peasants, taxed to the brink, turned their pitchforks on the nobility who'd bled them dry. When taxes weren't enough, rulers turned to bankers with trembling hands. The Medici and Fugger families became shadow kings, their loans propping up empires. But credit came at a staggering cost. Interest rates could reach 40%, and repayment deadlines turned victories into catastrophes. Spain's Philip II defaulted on debts 4 times, leaving his armies stranded and his reputation in tatters. Worse, bankers demanded collateral crown jewels, mining rights, even future tax revenues. A king might win the war only to find his treasury mortgaged for decades. Desperation bred darker solutions. Debasement, sneaking cheaper metals into coins, was like burning furniture to stay warm. It kept the lights on briefly but destroyed trust in the currency. England's Great Debasement under Henry VIII reduced silver content by 90%, sparking inflation so severe that soldiers' pay became worthless by the time it reached them. Meanwhile, plunder offered short-term relief but long-term chaos. The chevauchée tactics of the 100 Years' War, burning crops and looting towns, weren't just about terror, they were profit-seeking ventures. Yet stolen wealth rarely reached the crown. Soldiers pocketed treasures and commanders skimmed off the top, leaving the kingdom no richer, the cruelest irony. Victory could be as devastating as defeat. After conquering Normandy, England found itself ruling a wasteland field salted, towns smoldering, and survivors too destitute to pay taxes. The cost of garrisoning captured territories often exceeded their value, turning expansion into a financial black hole. Even the Crusades, framed as holy missions, became economic quagmires. Richard the Lionheart's ransom nearly broke England, requiring a Saladin tithe, so oppressive it sparked riots. Yet from this chaos emerged glimpses of modernity. Venice pioneered war bonds, letting citizens invest in campaigns for a share of future spoils. The Hanseatic League used trade networks as collateral, securing loans with wool and timber rather than gold. And somewhere in the smoke of these financial battlefields, a truth became clear. The real measure of a medieval ruler wasn't just his skill in battle, but his ability to balance the books when the fate of a kingdom hung in the balance. Because in the end, an army without coin was just a mob, and no amount of courage could fill an empty treasury. The screams of battle faded quickly, but the moans of the wounded lingered for weeks. In an age before antibiotics or sterilization, a single arrow wound could sentence a man to months of agony, his flesh turning black with gangrene as fever cooked him from within. Medieval armies didn't just lose soldiers on the battlefield, they bled them slowly in stinking tents where death came not with glory, but with the gurgle of a punctured lung or the stench of a festering limb. For every knight who fell to a sword strike, a dozen more succumbed to the real killers, infection, dysentery, and the brutal arithmetic of medieval medicine. Monks and barbers became unlikely battlefield heroes. These were the era's medics, men who knew more about leeches than anatomy, but who stanched wounds with whatever they had. Monasteries doubled as hospitals, their herb gardens supplying poultices of honey and garlic to slow rot. Barber surgeons, trained more in shaving beards than saving lives, performed amputations with the same tools they used for haircuts. Speed was their only ally. A leg could be sawed off in under a minute, the stump cauterized with boiling oil or a red-hot iron. The lucky ones passed out from pain. The unlucky ones died screaming when shock set in. Disease was the silent saboteur of every campaign. Camp followers, wives, cooks, prostitutes brought not just comfort but contagion. Tight quarters turned armies into petri dishes where typhus and cholera spread faster than rumors. The Crusader army at Antioch lost more men to starvation and plague than to Saracen blades. English longbowmen at Harfleur in 1415 found their ranks decimated not by French arrows, but by bloody flux from drinking contaminated water. Commanders quickly learned that a healthy army was a rare advantage, one worth protecting at all costs. Some leaders grasped the connection between care and morale. The Teutonic Knights built field hospitals that prioritized cleanliness centuries before germ theory, isolating the sick and burning contaminated bandages. Richard the Lionheart paid surgeons premium wages to follow his campaigns, knowing that soldiers fought harder when they believed survival was possible. But these were exceptions. Most medieval armies treated their wounded as afterthoughts, if they treated them at all. A peasant levy with a gut wound might be left to die under a tree, his cries ignored as the army marched on. The true measure of a force's resilience wasn't its numbers at the start of a campaign, but how many could still hold a weapon at the end. Armies that invested in medicine, however crude, could fight longer and recover faster. Those that didn't found their victories hollow, their ranks thinning not from enemy steel, but from the slow, inglorious ravages of neglect. In the calculus of medieval war, the sharpest weapon wasn't always a sword. Sometimes it was a clean bandage and a surgeon who cared enough to try. The morning mist clinging to the battlefield might hide more than just the enemy. It could conceal the empty spaces where men had stood the night before. Desertion was the slow bleed of medieval armies, a threat as persistent as any sword. When the bread ran moldy, the wounds festered, or the harvest moon reminded soldiers of unplanted fields back home, even the bravest might slip away under cover of darkness. Commanders knew this silent attrition could cripple a force faster than any cavalry charge. The difference between victory and defeat often came down to who could keep their men in line, and the methods ranged from brutal to brilliant. Discipline began with the lash. Chroniclers tell of English longbowmen caught deserting before Agincourt being flogged until their backs resembled raw meat, then forced to march at the front where enemy arrows would find them first. The Burgundians took it further. They branded deserters with hot irons, marking them as cowards for life. But physical terror had limits. A man who feared his commander more than the enemy might still break, and public executions could backfire, turning sullen resentment into outright mutiny. The smartest leaders balanced fear with something more potent, hope. Rewards proved just as powerful as punishments. After the siege of Calais, Edward III of England granted his archers parcels of conquered French land, turning potential deserters into landowners with stakes in the war's outcome. The Venetians took a different tack. Their galley rowers could earn early release by distinguishing themselves in battle, a prize worth fighting for. Even small gestures mattered. Henry V made a show of dining with common soldiers during the march to Agincourt, listening to their grievances and promising a share of spoils. These weren't acts of kindness. They were calculated moves to bind men's loyalty tighter than any chain. Yet the real art lay in prevention. Wise commanders kept their troops too busy to plot desertion. Endless drills, fortification repairs, even games of skill to stave off boredom. They stationed pickets not just to watch for enemies, but to monitor their own men, placing trusted veterans as keepers of the watch, who could spot restless whispers before they became midnight flights. And when homesickness gnawed at morale, leaders like Richard the Lionheart allowed carefully censored letters from home, knowing that a single scrap of parchment from a soldier's wife could steady his hand more than a dozen whippings. The true test came in retreat. A disciplined force could withdraw in good order, shields locked and spirits unbroken. A brittle one would shatter into a rabble, every man running for his life. At the Battle of Patay in 1429, the English learned this the hard way. Their usually steadfast archers broke ranks too soon, and the French cavalry turned an orderly retreat into a slaughter. The lesson echoed across centuries. Fear might keep men in line, but only pride, purpose, or the promise of a better tomorrow could make them stand when death loomed. In the end, the strongest armies weren't those with the harshest punishments, but those where soldiers believed their sacrifices meant something, and that was a weapon no enemy could easily break. History books love their knights and kings, but behind every medieval army marched a shadow force, women keeping the war machine alive. While they rarely wore armor, their contributions turned the tide of battles in ways chroniclers often ignored. From the smoke of campfires to the quiet halls of abandoned castles, women didn't just witness war, they sustained it. Take the camp followers, dismissed by nobles as useless mouths, but indispensable in reality. These weren't just wives trailing their husbands. They were laundresses scrubbing blood-stained gambesons, foragers scouring woods for herbs to treat fever, and cooks turning rancid meat into something barely edible. At the siege of Jerusalem, Crusader women hauled stones to rebuild shattered walls under arrow fire, while during the 100 Years' War, French women disguised as boys smuggled food into blockaded towns. Their work meant the difference between an army that fought and one that starved. Healing fell squarely on women's shoulders long before battlefield medicine was a formal craft. Monastic nuns like Hildegard of Bingen mixed poultices from garden herbs, their recipes passed down like military secrets. In camps, elderly women, often the only ones with knowledge of childbirth, applied those same skills to arrow wounds, using boiled linen to pack gashes and willow bark tea to dull pain. Their successes rarely made chronicles, but their failures did. When the English ran out of skilled women to treat dysentery at Harfleur, the disease killed more men than French swords ever could. Then there were the rule-breakers, women who refused to stay behind castle walls. Joan of Arc is the famous exception, but she wasn't alone. Spanish archives mention Catalina de Eroso, a nun who fled her convent, chopped off her hair, and fought as a soldier in the New World for 2 decades before her sex was discovered. English court records reveal women tried for wearing men's armor during the Wars of the Roses, their disguises only revealed when they were wounded or killed. These weren't anomalies, they were proof that for every woman documented in battle, dozens more likely fought and died anonymously, but the quietest power lay in stewardship. While lords campaigned, their wives became acting rulers, collecting taxes, mustering levies, even negotiating with enemies. Helena of Aquitaine governed England while Richard the Lionheart crusaded, crushing rebellions with the same ruthlessness as any king. Lesser-known noblewomen like Margaret of Beverwyck defended castles during sieges, directing archers and rationing supplies until relief came. Their letters reveal cold calculations, sacrificing outlying villages to preserve strongholds, or bribing mercenaries when loyalty faltered. The greatest irony, the very systems that excluded women from war relied on them to function. A knight's shining armor was useless without the blacksmith's wife keeping the forge fed. A marching army's strength depended on the widows and daughters left behind to harvest grain so soldiers wouldn't starve come winter. War wasn't just the business of men, it was a tapestry woven by countless hands, most of them unseen. And when the battles ended, it was women who buried the dead, rebuilt the villages, and bore the children who would one day march off to fight the same wars again. A minstrel's ballad could be sharper than any sword when kingdoms needed men to fight. In the flickering torchlight of taverns and the echoing halls of churches, rulers waged a war of words long before their armies met the enemy. This wasn't just morale boosting, it was psychological warfare, turning ordinary villagers into fervent believers in a cause they'd never questioned. Medieval propaganda didn't rely on printing presses or broadsheets. It thrived on emotion, repetition, and the timeless art of spinning defeat into divine purpose. Consider the power of the chanson de geste, epic poems recited in market squares. Songs like the Song of Roland transformed a disastrous ambush in the Pyrenees into a tale of heroic sacrifice, inspiring generations to see death in battle as a path to immortality. Troubadours weren't just entertainers, they were recruiters, their verses carefully crafted to remind listeners that cowardice shamed families, while valor brought eternal glory. Even the humblest farmer, after hearing how Roland blew his horn until his temples burst to summon Charlemagne's aid, might think twice about dodging the levy. The church's pulpit became a recruitment office. Priests framed wars as holy missions, their sermons laced with apocalyptic imagery. Before the Battle of Agincourt, English soldiers knelt in mud as bishops promised God's wrath would strike any man who fled. Papal indulgences, guarantees of reduced time in purgatory, were dangled like medals for enlistment, and when the enemy was Muslim, Jewish, or heretical, preachers dehumanized them with relish. Crusade chronicles described Saracens as blood-drinking monsters who desecrated altars, turning conquest into a moral obligation. Fear, when sanctified, became a draft notice no peasant could ignore. But propaganda's true genius lay in its flexibility. A crushing defeat could be rebranded overnight. After the Scots butchered English forces at Bannockburn, King Edward II's spin doctors claimed the loss was a test of faith, a necessary trial to purify the nation for greater victories. The French, reeling from Crécy, circulated rumors that English longbowmen used black magic, explaining away failure as the work of the devil rather than poor tactics. Defeated commanders became martyrs, retreats became strategic withdrawals. The message was clear: no battle was truly lost if the story could be controlled. Public spectacles sealed the deal. Returning victors paraded through cities with captured banners dragging in the dirt, while criers announced exaggerated body counts. The 1429 entry of Joan of Arc into Orleans wasn't just a celebration, it was theater, with her white armor and banner staged to look like divine intervention. Conversely, enemies were burned in effigy, their coats of arms defiled in town squares. Visual humiliation made abstract threats feel personal, stoking the crowd's thirst for revenge. Yet this manipulation had a dark edge. When Frederick Barbarossa's drowned corpse was hauled from a Turkish river during the Third Crusade, his advisors preserved his remains in vinegar so the army wouldn't disintegrate from despair. The truth, his death was hidden for weeks while they fabricated letters in his name, buying time to regroup. Such deception revealed propaganda's unspoken rule: belief was more vital than facts. A people convinced of their righteousness would endure starvation and slaughter. A single compelling lie could hold an army together longer than 100 rations of bread. The echoes of these tactics still resonate today. Modern recruitment posters and political slogans owe their DNA to those medieval bards and priests who understood a fundamental truth: wars aren't just won with steel. They're won in the hearts of those who believe the fight is worth dying for, and sometimes all it takes is the right story, told at the right time, to turn fear into fury and doubt into devotion. A river you've fished since childhood isn't just water, it's a weapon. Those hidden bends where trout gather, perfect for ambushing supply barges, the muddy bank your father warned you about. Now it's where enemy cavalry will sink. Medieval defenders knew every gully, thicket, and steep hill like the lines on their palms, and they turned that intimacy into a brutal advantage. While invaders staggered under unfamiliar skies, locals fought like ghosts, melting into landscapes they'd known since birth. Guerrilla warfare wasn't invented in the modern era, it was perfected by desperate medieval peasants. In the Scottish Highlands, clansmen used narrow glens as natural kill zones, rolling boulders onto English troops from cliffs above. Welsh archers vanished into misty forests, their longbows silent until the moment they unleashed storms of arrows at point-blank range. These weren't pitched battles, they were surgical strikes designed to bleed invaders dry. The French routiers disbanded mercenaries turned bandits, mastered this shadow war, attacking supply lines by night and vanishing before dawn. Their favorite trick, poisoning wells with dead livestock, forcing enemy columns to detour miles for fresh water. Scorched earth became the ultimate act of defiance. When the Mongols swept into Hungary in 1241, locals didn't just retreat, they burned their own granaries and poisoned their wells. The invaders found a wasteland where villages stood empty, their thatched roofs reduced to ash. Russian princes used the same tactic against the Golden Horde, leaving nothing but frozen mud and hunger for the horsemen who outmatched them in open combat. This wasn't surrender, it was strategy. A starving army loses discipline faster than it loses soldiers, but terrain's real power lay in psychological warfare. Swiss mountain fighters draped white sheets over their armor during winter campaigns, becoming nearly invisible against snow. Spanish almogavars, light infantry raised in the Pyrenees, would howl like wolves before night raids, playing on superstitious fears. The message to invaders was clear: you might own the castle, but these woods, these hills, they belong to us. And every snapped twig, every rustle in the dark, would gnaw at the confidence of even the most hardened knights. The lesson echoed across centuries. Size mattered less than familiarity. At the Battle of Morgarten in 1315, a few thousand Swiss peasants lured Austrian knights onto a narrow lakeside path, then rolled tree trunks down the slopes, crushing armor like tin. The survivors floundered into the lake, dragged under by their own plate mail. No grand tactics, no chivalric charges, just an intimate knowledge of how terrain could multiply strength. For defenders fighting on home ground, every rock had purpose, every thicket held potential, and in those moments, the land itself became the most loyal soldier of all. A knight unhorsed and disarmed wasn't necessarily doomed. He might just be the day's winning lottery ticket. Medieval battlefields operated on a brutal hierarchy of value, where a prisoner's fate hinged less on mercy and more on cold calculation. High-born captives could walk away with their lives after promising fortunes in ransom, while lowly foot soldiers faced the sword or the slave markets. This wasn't just cruelty, it was a perverse economy where human lives carried price tags scribbled in blood and silver. The ransom system functioned like a twisted stock exchange. A noble's worth depended on lineage, lands, and reputation factors carefully appraised by the victors. When the Black Prince captured King John the Good of France at Poitiers in 1356, he didn't just gain a prisoner, he secured a bargaining chip worth half of France's annual revenue. But even minor knights could fetch sums equivalent to a farmer's lifetime earnings, leading to absurd scenes where captors guarded high-value prisoners like treasure chests mid-battle. The English at Agincourt famously herded French nobles behind their lines, only to panic when a rumored counterattack forced them to slaughter their own golden geese. Common soldiers enjoyed no such protection. Without wealthy relatives or political connections, they were disposable. After the Battle of Nicopolis in 1396, Ottoman forces executed thousands of captured crusaders, stacking their heads into pyramids as warnings. The Mongols took a different approach. Skilled artisans might be spared as slaves, while the rest were butchered to terrorize future enemies. These weren't just acts of savagery, they were psychological weapons. A commander who showed mercy to peasants might be seen as weak, while one who slaughtered indiscriminately could provoke desperate last stands. Yet morality occasionally pierced the pragmatism. During the siege of Jerusalem, both Crusaders and Saracens occasionally exchanged prisoners for humanitarian reasons, recognizing shared suffering in the desert heat. The legendary Saladin earned European respect by releasing hundreds of captives without ransom, a gesture that blurred the lines between chivalry and propaganda. Even mercenary bands developed unwritten rules. Swiss pikemen might spare foes who spoke their dialect, seeing them as potential future employers rather than enemies. The darkest twist, ransom culture incentivized survival over victory. At the Battle of Brustum in 1467, Burgundian knights allegedly ignored their losing position to focus on capturing high-value opponents, treating war like a grim treasure hunt. Meanwhile, the rise of gunpowder weapons eroded the system. Why risk capturing an armored noble when a cannonball could obliterate his ransom value in an instant? Prisoner policies revealed a fundamental truth of medieval warfare. Every decision, from sparing a life to taking one, was a chess move in a game where morality and strategy were forever locked in uneasy tension. The way an army treated its captives didn't just reflect its commander's soul, it exposed his deepest calculations about power, profit, and the price of a human life. The battlefield fell silent, but the real work was just beginning. A kingdom fresh from war resembled a gutted house wall still standing, but everything inside in ruins. Fields that once fed thousands lay choked with weeds, their farmers buried in shallow graves. Towns stood as hollow shells, their markets picked clean by looters and their workshops stripped for scrap. Victory might earn a ruler cheers in the moment, but the next months and years would determine whether those cheers turned to curses. Rebuilding wasn't just about bricks and mortar, it was about stitching a fractured society back together before the seams gave way. Repopulation became a desperate race against decay. plagues often followed armies like shadows, cutting down survivors already weakened by hunger. In Normandy after the 100 Years' War, entire villages stood empty, their doors creaking in the wind. Smart rulers turned immigration into policy, offering tax breaks to foreigners willing to till abandoned fields, or pardoning criminals who'd agree to settle war-torn regions. The Teutonic Knights went further, recruiting German farmers with promises of free land in Prussia, creating a patchwork of new communities where burned-out strongholds once stood. But even these measures couldn't replace the lost generations. A chronicler in Bohemia wrote of widows ploughing fields themselves, their hands blistered and backs bent under the weight of work meant for their dead husbands. Rebuilding towns demanded more than labor, it required trust. Merchants wouldn't return to looted market squares without guarantees of safety, so kings issued letters of protection, promising swift justice for thieves. Craftsmen needed materials, leading to royal mandates that forests be spared for timber rather than burned as tactical barriers. Some rulers got creative after sacking Limoges in 1370. The Black Prince rebuilt its walls at his own expense, a rare admission that destruction had gone too far. But the scars ran deep. In Florence, the scars of factional wars were carved literally into the stone. New buildings rose with narrower streets, designed to be easily barricaded when the next conflict came. Veterans posed the trickiest challenge. Soldiers who'd bled for a crown expected payment beyond hollow thanks. Land was the preferred currency. English kings parceled out confiscated French estates after Agincourt, while Spanish Reconquista fighters received olive groves and vineyards. But when rewards fell short, trouble brewed. The condottieri of Italy demobilized mercenaries with no peacetime skills became roaming bandits, their armor repurposed for robbery. In England, the 1381 Peasants' Revolt was fueled in part by archers returning from France to find their villages taxed into poverty. A wise ruler knew an unpaid soldier with a sword was a spark next to dry tinder. The cruelest irony, peace could bankrupt a kingdom faster than war. Rebuilding bridges and mills drained treasuries already emptied by years of conflict. Some rulers resorted to selling titles or monopolies, a quick fix that created long-term corruption. Others leaned on the church, borrowing silver reliquaries to mint coins, promising repayment in prayers. The shrewdest invested in symbols. When Charles the Bold of Burgundy rebuilt his shattered territories, he commissioned tapestries showing orderly cities and bountiful harvests propaganda to convince his people and enemies alike that recovery wasn't just possible, but inevitable. True stability required more than physical repair. It demanded rewriting the social contract. The Black Death a century earlier had shown that survivors of catastrophe expected better wages and rights. Now, war's survivors wanted the same. Smart rulers granted charters to towns, loosening feudal bonds in exchange for loyalty. Others reformed courts, knowing that fair justice was cheaper than putting down rebellions. The lesson was clear. A kingdom rebuilt exactly as before was a kingdom doomed to repeat its mistakes. The greatest leaders didn't just restore what was lost, they planted seeds for something stronger, knowing that the next war would be won not just on battlefields, but in the hearts of those who had reason to defend what they'd built. The 100 Years' War wasn't just a clash of kings, it was a laboratory for desperation. For over a century, England and France tore each other apart, only to rebuild their armies again and again from the shattered remnants of the last campaign. This wasn't warfare as romanticized in tapestries. It was a grinding struggle where survival depended on constantly reinventing how armies were raised, paid, and motivated. And in that brutal process, both nations wrote the playbook for medieval military innovation under fire. England's secret weapon wasn't just the longbow, it was paperwork. The kingdom's system of indenture contracts turned warfare into a business transaction, with captains signing agreements to deliver a set number of men for a fixed price. These weren't feudal levies bound by tradition, but proto-professionals recruited for specific campaigns. The contracts spelled out everything from pay rates to loot distribution, creating a mercenary-like efficiency. When Henry V invaded France in 1415, his army included not just knights, but carpenters and masons hired to rebuild siege engines on the fly. Yet this system had a fatal flaw: money. Parliament balked at funding endless war, forcing English commanders to lean harder on plunder. The infamous chevauchée raids burning crops, torching towns, weren't just tactics of terror. They were payroll strategies turning French countryside into English wages. France's response showcased both the flexibility and fragility of feudal systems. After the disaster at Agincourt, the crown bypassed reluctant nobles by appealing directly to towns. Cities like Paris and Rouen raised militia companies funded by local taxes, their members training weekly in exchange for tax exemptions. These weren't peasants dragged to war, but butchers and bakers who could form shield walls as deftly as they needed dough. The crown also exploited a loophole in feudal law, the arrière ban, a general summons that allowed kings to conscript every able-bodied man in emergencies. What began as a rarely used royal prerogative became a regular draft by the war's end. Yet desperation bred innovation. French commanders like Berthe and du Guesclin pioneered guerrilla tactics, avoiding pitched battles in favor of ambushing supply lines and retaking castles through stealth. The war's true legacy lay in its mercenary problem. Both sides relied heavily on routiers, bands of discharged soldiers turned professional marauders. These weren't the romanticized free companies of legend, but roaming threats that made no distinction between friend or foe. The tarred Venus mercenaries in 1362 were so notorious they forced the Pope to flee Avignon. Kings alternately hired and hunted these bands, creating a vicious cycle where trained fighters had no peacetime livelihood except banditry, the solution. Some were shipped off to crusades in Eastern Europe as expendable shock troops, a medieval version of outsourcing trouble. Perhaps the most surprising twist was the war's impact on national identity. English archers at Crecy didn't fight for feudal lords. They fought under banners of St. George, a unifying symbol. French resistance under Joan of Arc transformed from a dynastic squabble into a patriotic crusade. The very act of repeated recruitment forged something unprecedented: the idea that soldiers owed loyalty not just to a person, but to a concept of homeland. By the time the war sputtered to its exhausted close, both nations bore little resemblance to their 14th century selves. The armies they'd built in desperation hadn't just fought battles, they'd reshaped what it meant to be English or French. And that transformation would echo far beyond any battlefield. The Reconquista wasn't just a war, it was a slow-burning fire that reshaped an entire peninsula over centuries. For the Christian kingdoms of northern Spain, every inch of territory reclaimed from Moorish rulers required more than battlefield bravery. It demanded a delicate alchemy of faith, feudal loyalty, and sheer improvisation. Picture the rugged hills of Asturias in the 8th century, where a handful of Visigothic nobles, backed by local shepherds and mountain clans, began pushing back against the Umayyad Caliphate that had swallowed their homeland. They weren't just fighting for land, they were stitching together a new identity from fragments of faith and desperation. What made their struggle unique was how they weaponized belief. The Church declared the Reconquista a holy war long before the Crusades to Jerusalem, offering the same spiritual rewards for fighting Moors in Iberia as for liberating the Holy Land. Pilgrims traveling to Santiago de Compostela didn't just carry rosaries, they brought swords, swelling the ranks of local lords during campaigning seasons. Monasteries like Cluny became recruiting hubs, their abbots preaching that driving Islam from Spain was God's will written in the very geography of the land. Yet this religious fervor had a pragmatic edge. Kings like Ferdinand III of Castile knew that calling the Reconquista a crusade opened the floodgates to European knights seeking redemption and loot. These foreign warriors brought cutting-edge tactics, from Norman siege engines to Frankish heavy cavalry, but they also demanded payment in conquered cities and titles. Faith moved armies, but land titles kept them fighting. Feudal levies formed the backbone of these campaigns, but with a twist. Unlike France or England, where noble obligations were rigidly defined, Spanish lords operated under the fueros local charters that granted freedoms in exchange for military service. A peasant who fought could earn rights to farm reclaimed lands tax-free, turning foot soldiers into stakeholders in the war's success. The military orders Knights of Calatrava, Santiago, and Alcantara merged monastic discipline with battlefield pragmatism, holding frontier castles like a chain of firebreaks against Moorish counterattacks. Their secret: they didn't just defend territory, they colonized it, settling captured lands with Christian farmers who doubled as militia. Tactical innovation blossomed in this pressure cooker. Spanish commanders mastered the art of la tornadiza, feigned retreats that lured overconfident Moorish cavalry into ambushes where crossbowmen waited in hidden defiles. They learned to fight in the meseta, the high central plains where summer heat crippled armored knights, by adopting lighter gear and relying on local almogavers, guerrilla fighters who could march for days on handfuls of parched grain. When they finally breached the walls of cities like Toledo or Cordoba, they didn't just sack them, they repurposed Moorish infrastructure, turning mosques into cathedrals and irrigation systems into agricultural engines for their new settlements. The real genius of the Reconquista lay in its flexibility. When the Almohad Caliphate surged back in the 12th century with fanatical Berber warriors, the Spanish didn't double down on tradition, they adapted. Alfonso VIII of Castile forged alliances with rival Christian kingdoms, uniting Aragon, Navarre, and Portugal at Los Navas de Tolosa in 1212 for the peninsula's most decisive battle. They won not through sheer numbers, but by coordinating disparate forces. Aragonese knights held the flanks while Castilian infantry pushed the center, and local shepherds guided them through hidden mountain passes to outflank the enemy. Victory didn't come from purity, but from pragmatism, welcoming Jewish financiers to bankroll campaigns, tolerating Moorish artisans to rebuild conquered cities, and blending traditions into something uniquely Iberian. By the time Granada fell in 1492, the Reconquista had birthed more than a reunited Spain. It had created a blueprint for turning fractured loyalties into a unified war machine. The lessons written in blood and dust along the frontier still resonate. Survival goes to those who can bind together the irreconcilable faith and profit, tradition and innovation, the sword and the plow into a single, unstoppable purpose. The Wars of the Roses didn't just tear England apart, they turned warfare into a revolving door of loyalty and betrayal. Picture this: a nobleman rides to battle under one king's banner, only to switch sides mid-campaign when offered better lands or a fatter purse. Armies materialized overnight, stitched together by oaths that often dissolved faster than morning mist. This wasn't just civil war, it was a high-stakes game where the rules changed by the hour, and the price of misjudging our allies' trust could be a severed head on London Bridge. At the heart of this chaos lay a dangerous truth: feudal obligation had eroded, replaced by personal ambition. The great magnates, the Nevilles, Percys, and Yorks raised troops not because the crown demanded it, but because they promised plunder or protection. A lord's retainers, clad in livery badges that marked them as private soldiers rather than national ones, followed their patron's whims more readily than any abstract notion of England. When Warwick the Kingmaker switched allegiance from York to Lancaster in 1469, thousands of men turned their coats without hesitation, their loyalty as flexible as the weather. Recruitment tactics became brutally pragmatic. Lords exploited tenant contracts, inserting clauses that bound farmers to armed service in exchange for rent reductions. Towns fearing sack raised hasty militias, while unemployed veterans of the French wars sold their skills to the highest bidder. The speed of mobilization was staggering. Edward IV marched on London in 1471 with an army assembled in days, its ranks filled by promises of pardons for outlaws and cash bonuses for archers. Yet these forces were brittle. After the Battle of Towton, the largest and bloodiest clash of the war, chroniclers noted that many Lancastrian survivors simply walked home, their obligation to defeated lords voided by defeat. The real innovation and tragedy of this conflict was its privatization of violence. Noble households became miniature war departments, maintaining standing retinues of men at arms even in peacetime. These weren't the rustic levies of old, but semi-professional killers who trained year-round. Richard of Gloucester, later Richard III, kept a personal army of northern retainers so fiercely loyal they followed him to the death at Bosworth Field. But such loyalty came at a cost. When a patron fell, his followers faced proscription or execution, creating cycles of vengeance that stretched across generations. Yet amid the carnage, glimpses of modernity emerged. The Tudors, watching this bloodbath from exile, learned a critical lesson. A kingdom couldn't thrive while power was parceled out to private armies. Henry VII's victory at Bosworth didn't just end the wars. It began the deliberate dismantling of noble military autonomy. Laws against livery and maintenance sought to break the magnates' grip on recruitment, while royal control of artillery trains made rebellion increasingly suicidal. The Wars of the Roses, for all their brutality, became the furnace in which medieval factionalism was burned away, leaving behind the faint outline of something new, a state where loyalty to the crown outweighed loyalty to a lord. But that transformation would demand rivers of blood before it was complete. The clash of steel on a medieval battlefield might seem worlds away from modern warfare, but strip away the chainmail and longbows, and you'll find timeless truths about conflict that still resonate today. The challenges of raising, supplying, and motivating an army haven't vanished. They've just swapped horses for helicopters and parchment for spreadsheets. Medieval commanders grappled with problems any modern general would recognize: how to feed thousands in hostile territory, how to turn raw recruits into cohesive units, and how to sustain morale when death looms. Their solutions, forged in desperation, echo in surprising places. From corporate leadership seminars to Pentagon war games, take decentralized command, a concept medieval warlords mastered out of necessity. When communication relied on runners or signal flags, micromanaging was impossible. Instead, leaders like Genghis Khan empowered subordinate officers to make split-second decisions, trusting their knowledge of local terrain and tactics. Fast forward to the 21st century, and you'll see the same principle in modern special forces operations. The U.S. Army's mission command philosophy, emphasizing initiative over rigid orders, could have been lifted straight from the playbook of a Mongol two-man commander. Both eras prove when chaos reigns, flexibility beats brute force. Psychological warfare, another medieval specialty, has evolved but not vanished. The terror inspired by Viking longships appearing at dawn is mirrored in today's drone strikes, both designed to paralyze foes before the first blow lands. Medieval propagandists spread rumors of invincible warriors or divine favor. Modern militaries weaponize social media using algorithms to amplify fear or dissent. Even the humble siege engine finds its counterpart in cyberattacks. Both target an enemy's infrastructure to erode willpower. The tools have changed, but the goal remains identical: break the opponent's spirit before breaking their walls. Logistics, the unglamorous backbone of any campaign, binds past and present even tighter. A medieval quartermaster counting sacks of grain would instantly understand the agony of a NATO supply officer tracking fuel convoys through hostile terrain. The Swiss mercenaries of the 1400s pioneered living off the land tactics now standard in guerrilla warfare, while the Byzantine theme system, where soldier farmers defended their own soil, finds echoes in Israel's reserve forces. Both eras reveal the same lesson: an army that can't sustain itself is just a mob waiting to dissolve. Perhaps the most enduring legacy lies in leadership. The best medieval commanders, Saladin, Joan of Arc, Edward the Black Prince, knew their troops weren't just tools, but human beings who needed purpose as much as pay. They shared hardships, led from the front, and turned shared suffering into camaraderie. Modern studies of unit cohesion in Iraq and Afghanistan confirm what these leaders intuited: trust between soldiers matters more than technology. A drone operator might sit continents away from the battlefield, but even they fight harder when they believe in their cause and their commanders. The thread connecting these eras isn't just tactics or tools, it's the unchanging nature of human conflict. Whether facing a cavalry charge or a suicide bomber, the core challenges remain. How do you inspire ordinary people to do extraordinary things? How do you outthink an enemy when brute force fails? And how do you rebuild when the fighting ends? The answers: medieval armies forged in fire aren't relics, they're roadmaps, proving that even in an age of AI and satellites, war remains fundamentally human. And that's a truth as old as the first sword ever swung. Building a medieval army from scratch wasn't just a military challenge, it was a high-stakes test of human ingenuity under the shadow of annihilation. Imagine the weight on a ruler's shoulders, knowing that every recruitment decision could mean the difference between a kingdom's survival and its erasure from history. The methods varied: feudal levies, town militias, mercenary bands, but the desperation behind them was universal. These weren't abstract strategies. They were life-or-death calculations made by leaders who knew that failure would leave their people enslaved, their cities in ashes. Take the mercenaries' bargain, for instance. Hiring professional killers solved immediate problems but created long-term vulnerabilities. A ruler might secure victory today, only to find those same hired blades turning on him tomorrow when pay ran short. The White Company's betrayals weren't exceptions, they were warnings etched in blood. Yet what choice remained when invaders were at the gates? This was the cruel calculus of medieval warfare. Sometimes the risk of future chaos was the only price for present survival. Faith offered another kind of currency, one that didn't drain treasuries but demanded its own sacrifices. When Pope Urban II launched the First Crusade, he didn't just recruit soldiers, he unleashed a tidal wave of belief powerful enough to drown skepticism. Peasants who'd never held swords marched thousands of miles, convinced that death in battle would wash away lifetimes of sin. Yet this divine fervor came with its own perils. The same faith that inspired heroism could justify atrocities, turning holy wars into spirals of vengeance that lasted generations. The true unsung heroes of these struggles weren't always the knights or kings, but the ordinary people thrust into extraordinary roles. A blacksmith hammering spearheads through the night, a farmer's wife tending wounded soldiers with herb poultices, a scribe forging recruitment letters. These were the threads that held armies together. Their contributions rarely made chronicles, but without them, even the grandest strategies would have unraveled. What makes these medieval dilemmas so resonant today is their raw humanity. Strip away the chainmail and castles, and you're left with timeless questions. How far would you go to protect what you love when resources are scarce? Who gets sacrificed? Can violence ever truly secure peace? The answers medieval leaders found were messy, imperfect, and often tragic, but they shaped the world we inherited. If this deep dive into the crucible of medieval warfare left you as awestruck as we were, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Drop a comment below sharing which tactic surprised you most. Was it the psychological warfare of the Welsh rebels, or the financial brinkmanship of kings juggling mercenary payments? Your insights keep this channel's community as lively as a medieval tavern after a victory. Until next time, remember, history isn't just about dates and battles, it's about the choices that echo across